The female role and feminine aspect of spirituality, Vedic Rishikas and Brahmavadinis. Today, we will take a step back from analyzing specific metaphysical or spiritual concepts to delve into history. However, this exploration is equally valuable as it provides insights into the environment in which India's philosophical ideas, schools of thought, movements, and sects emerged, evolved, and transformed. In this multi-series study, we will look at the history of India not in the usual way, as it happens from the point of view of cultural or geopolitical transformations, but from the point of view of spiritual and Vedic traditions, and with an emphasis on the female role in this process, immersing ourselves in all the diversity of religions and teachings, revealing their ideas and philosophies. However, given the strict patriarchal norms of post-Vedic society, which significantly limited the participation of women in the spiritual aspects of life, it will be difficult to constantly adhere to an exclusively female line of narration, although this will be an important accent of the entire study. Also, some series will feature biographical sketches and stories of the most outstanding women whose legacy remembered today in various spiritual traditions. The main focus of this part of the study will be on the prominent women in the spirituality of the Vedic era, their roles in the spiritual environment of that era, and their contributions to religious and philosophical thought. Additionally, we will examine their roles and rights within a society shaped by the rules of the Varna system and the later rigidities of the caste system, Jati, and the laws of Manu, Smriti. Throughout history, women have played an indispensable role in shaping spiritual traditions and philosophical thought. Their voices have resonated through the ages, inspiring countless seekers to explore the depths of human potential and divine connection. Among these remarkable figures are women who transcended the boundaries of their time, offering profound insights into the nature of existence and the path to spiritual liberation. This chapter explores the lives and teachings of Maitreyi, Gargi Vachaknavi, Lopamudra, Vak Ambhrini, and Yogini Gosha, philosophers and sages of Vedic India, from about 1,500 years before the Common Era to the year 500 before the Common Era. The Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda, are not structured as sociological or historical records, nor do they provide a systematic or uniform depiction of women's roles. Instead, they contain hymns of diverse themes, including philosophical, ritualistic, and mythological perspectives, which naturally present women in different lights depending on the context. There is no single Vedic woman archetype, as the Vedas reflect the diversity of social life and individual expression. In some hymns, women appear in roles that are submissive and complacent, reflecting family and household values. In others, they are commanding, wise, and rebellious. However, the multifaceted and varied depictions of women in the Vedas suggest that women of that time had a degree of freedom in both action and intellectual and spiritual participation. In fact, this variety itself indicates that women played a more dynamic role in society than what later social structures allowed. The status of women in early Vedic times was nuanced and multifaceted, reflecting a complex interplay of rights, responsibilities, and societal roles. Women were accorded significant respect and opportunities in many spheres of life, including education, spirituality, and family. Female sages, known as Rishikas or Brahmavadinis, women ascetics, such as Gargi and Maitreyi, were renowned for their knowledge of the Vedas and their philosophical insights. Women were believed to actively participate in Vedic rituals and religious practices, with the ability to compose hymns, perform sacrifices, and engage in spiritual debates. The institution of marriage was respected, and women within it enjoyed certain freedoms. In the Vedic age, marriage was often based on mutual consent, as exemplified by the concept of Gandharva Vivaha, love marriage without parental involvement, though this form was later criticized in the Manusmriti. In some cases, women could choose their husbands through Swayamvara, a ceremony where the bride selected her spouse. Additionally, widows were allowed to remarry under certain circumstances, reflecting a degree of social flexibility and freedom. However, the division of roles between men and women often reflected a patriarchal structure. While women had spiritual and intellectual agency, their primary roles were typically linked to domestic responsibilities and the continuity of the family. This, although a patriarchal model of relations, in the Vedic period it rather emphasized complementary roles. Men and women were seen as two halves of a whole, each fulfilling distinct responsibilities that were integral to societal and cosmic balance. Rita. The Rigveda describes women as Jaya, victory bringers, and Mater, mothers, emphasizing their nurturing and creative roles in perpetuating life and supporting societal and spiritual continuity. The symbolic representation of cosmic balance is often illustrated in rituals where the wife actively participates with her husband in sacrifices, yajnas, as an equal partner in sustaining Rita. The Grahapatni, householder's wife, was an indispensable part of domestic rituals, particularly in the Agnihotra, fire offerings, where she tended the sacred fire alongside her husband. The Rigveda refers to the partnership between husband and wife as dampati, indicating mutual respect and shared responsibilities in both spiritual and material realms. Additionally, the Upanishads recognize the interplay of dualities: Prakriti, nature, often equated with the feminine principle, and Purusha, spirit, often equated with the masculine principle, as crucial to spiritual realization. This concept, particularly emphasized in the Samkhya philosophy, explains the dynamic relationship between the manifest Prakriti and the unmanifest Purusha as the foundation of existence. Building upon this idea, Shaivism considers Purusha as Shiva, consciousness, and Shakti as energy or dynamic power, emphasizing their inseparable union as the essence of creation and cosmic order. In this view, Shiva, Purusha, represents the static, unchanging principle of pure awareness, while Shakti manifests as the active, creative force that brings potential into reality. Thus, Shakti manifests not only in divine forms like Parvati or Durga, but also in all aspects of creation, as the very force of creation itself. Together, Shiva and Shakti symbolize the cosmic interplay of male and female forces, demonstrating their mutual dependence in sustaining and evolving the universe. However, these roles, while complementary, especially as a philosophical concept, were shaped in practice by evolving patriarchal norms that often restricted women's broader participation in societal and spiritual domains, particularly in later periods. In the early Vedic period, society was organized around the Varna system, which was more flexible and functionally based, rather than the rigid caste system, Jati, that developed later. The Varna system is described in the Vedas, notably in the Purusha Sukta of the Rigveda, and divides society into four broad categories based on functional roles: Brahmins, priests and scholars; Kshatriyas, warriors and rulers; Vaishyas, traders and agriculturalists; Shudras, servants and laborers. This division was initially a functional and flexible system and was based on one's qualities, guna, and actions, karma, rather than birth. The rights and duties of women, as well as men, were influenced by their varna, with those of higher social strata often having more opportunities for education and spiritual pursuits. Over time, social norms began to change, and the restrictions affected both men and women, especially those from the lower Varnas. The changes occurred gradually, but already in the post-Vedic period, restrictions on women's participation in certain rituals and education became more pronounced. While women faced some, and sometimes significant limitations, particularly in the post-Vedic era, their contributions to philosophy, spirituality, and society were profound and enduring. Throughout Vedic history, Rishikas and Brahmavadinis stood as luminous examples of women's intellectual and spiritual agency. These titles distinguished women who dedicated their lives to the study, teaching, and realization of spiritual truths within the Vedic tradition. Rishikas were women sages who composed hymns found in the Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda. For instance, Vak Ambhrini, the seer of the famous Devi Sukta, is primarily celebrated for her profound spiritual realization and her hymn praising the divine feminine principle. These women were often as mantra drashtas, those who saw the mantras and passed on this knowledge. Brahmavadinis, on the other hand, were women ascetics devoted to the pursuit of Brahman, the ultimate reality. They were scholars and teachers who engaged in rigorous study and debate, often equaling or surpassing their male counterparts. Maitreyi, for example, is renowned for her dialogue with Yajnavalkya in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where she questions and seeks to understand the ultimate nature of reality. While Rishikas and Brahmavadinis often overlapped in their pursuits, the former were traditionally associated with the composition of hymns in the Vedic texts, whereas the latter focused more on philosophical discourse and, at times, ascetic practices, including sannyasa, formal renunciation, or tyaga, detachment. Women seeking practical realization were often referred to as sadhvas and yoginis, particularly in the later post-Vedic period. I think since we have already touched on the topic of the Vedas, including the Rig Veda and other texts, it is worth briefly understanding these scriptures, as we will repeatedly reference them and other sacred texts of India in this series of videos dedicated to the female role in spirituality. Broadly, the sacred texts of India are divided into Sruti and Smriti. Shruti refers to the main body of the Vedas, considered divine revelation directly heard by sages. Smriti, on the other hand, consists of remembered traditions, laws, and teachings, often inspired by or based on Shruti. The Rig Veda is one of the four Vedas, Shruti. As the oldest and most foundational text, the Rig Veda forms the basis for the other three Vedas, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharva Veda, which adapt and expand upon its principles to guide rituals, chants, and practical applications. Each of the four Vedas is structured into four parts: Samhitas, hymns and mantras; Brahmanas, prose texts with explanations of rituals; Aranyakas, philosophical discussions connected to forest practices; and Upanishads, spiritual and philosophical teachings. Among these, the Upanishads are the final portion of each Veda and focus on profound philosophical questions about the nature of the self, Atman, and ultimate reality, Brahman. They represent the Mukhya principal Upanishads, which are the oldest and most authoritative Upanishads, forming the Vedantic core of the Vedas. In addition to these, later Upanishads emerged over time, often associated with specific traditions such as Yoga, Shaiva, Shakta, Vaishnava, and Sannyasa. These non-Mukhya Upanishads are not the original concluding sections of the Vedas, but reflect the evolving spiritual landscape of India. Since many Upanishads are anonymous or attributed to legendary figures, it is difficult to confirm whether any female sages actually composed parts of these texts. However, their presence in Upanishadic dialogues suggests that some women were involved in their transmission and philosophical discussions. Thus, in the compilation of the Rig Veda between 1500 and 1200 before Common Era, both male rishis and female rishikas participated, such as Lopamudra, Gosha, Apala, and Vishvavara. However, in the compilation of later texts, the role of women becomes less prominent. By the period of the Puranas, approximately 500 and 1500 years of Common Era, a more rigid social order based on caste and patriarchal norms had emerged, significantly restricting women's spiritual roles. In the post-Vedic, Puranic or Smriti era, the sacred literature of Hinduism expanded beyond the four Vedas, Shruti, or revealed texts, to include numerous Smriti, remembered texts. Puranas, extensive collections of mythologies, cosmology, and religious practices intended to complement and make Vedic teachings more accessible to the general population. Itihasas, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, epic narratives that also serve as texts of Dharma and are central to many Bhakti traditions. Among them, the Bhagavad Gita, a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna within the Mahabharata, stands as one of the most important scriptures, deeply influencing yoga, bhakti, and Advaita Vedanta traditions. These epics are also classified as Mahakavya, great poetry. Dharma Shastra, texts like Manusmriti outlining laws, ethics, and social norms. Throughout the video, we will periodically refer to the Manusmriti, as it later had a significant influence on the establishment of a strict caste system and the discrimination against women's rights in Indian society. Vedangas, 6 auxiliary disciplines, phonetics, grammar, metrics, ritual instructions, astronomy, and etymology, that support Vedic study and practice. Tantras and Agamas. Tantras focus on esoteric practices within the Shakta tradition, while Agamas are theological and ritual texts found in the Shakta, Shaiva, and Vaishnava, Pancharatra, and Vaikanasa traditions. Upveda, texts related to the practical applications of Vedic knowledge, such as Ayurveda, medicine, Dhanurveda, martial arts, and Gandharva Veda, music and arts, which bring Vedic wisdom into various domains of life. Shad Darshana, the 6 systems of philosophy, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta, each with its own texts that elucidate the fundamental principles of each philosophy. A prominent example is the Prasthanatrayi, the core texts of Vedanta, which include the Upanishads, Brahma Sutras, and Bhagavad Gita. Together, all these texts represent the diverse religious and philosophical traditions that have shaped Hinduism, presenting it in its current form. There are also many additional texts linked to specific traditions, sects, and schools. For example, the Natha Sampradaya emphasizes texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika. The Vaishnava Sampradaya reveres works such as the Divya Prabandham and Sandilya Bhakti Sutras, and the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are significant across various yoga schools. It is important to emphasize that not all of the aforementioned texts are mandatory in every tradition. Many texts related to moral and practical knowledge for daily life focus on external aspects and may be of interest to Brahmins, but hold little value for direct realization in the spiritual experience of yoga. Additionally, each tradition may be oriented toward different Vedic texts or maintain its own lineage of transmitting texts that are not part of the main body of Indian Shruti literature. In the spiritual traditions of India, some paths do not rely on the authority of the Vedas at all, instead prioritizing the teachings of founding gurus or the poetry of Bhakti traditions. These paths often emphasize more direct means of realization, contrasting with the ritual worship prevalent in the Brahminical segment. While women's participation in the composition of canonical texts like the Vedas, Upanishads, and Puranas diminished over time, there is evidence that women contributed to non-canonical and regional traditions, particularly in Tantra, Shaktism, Bhakti movements, and other localized schools of spirituality. The Bhakti movements embraced more inclusive views, with women emerging as prominent figure through poetry and vachanas, prose poems, powerful expressions of devotion and spiritual equality. For example, Mirabai's poetry holds a central place in many Krishna-centered Bhakti traditions, particularly in Rajasthan, Gujarat, and North India. In the following videos devoted to women's contributions to spirituality, we will explore the Bhakti movement in detail, including its various schools and trends, as well as the biographies of women like Mirabai, Akkamahadevi, and others. However, let us return to the Vedic era of the Rishikas and Brahmavadinis. The roles of Rishikas and Brahmavadinis were not strictly caste-bound. However, they were more likely to be found among the Brahmin or Kshatriya classes, where access to education and spiritual knowledge was more readily available. It would have been rare for women of lower Varna to occupy these positions, though there are occasional references in the texts to women from different backgrounds engaging in spiritual practice. The key factor was intellectual and spiritual aptitude, which transcended caste to some degree, though Varna's privileges would certainly have played a role in who could formally access these spiritual roles. The Vedic era was marked by a tradition of oral transmission, where both men and women learned the sacred texts under the guidance of a guru. Women from the Brahmin Varna, especially those within Brahminical families, often had more institutionalized access to spiritual teachings, particularly those related to Vedic scriptures. The Gurukula system in Vedic times was a traditional mode of education in which students lived with their teacher, guru, in an ashram-like setting, receiving instruction in various disciplines. However, by the later Vedic period, formal education in Gurukulas, though common for boys from the Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya Varnas, largely excluded Shudras. While Shudras, whose primary role was service and labor, were typically barred from Vedic studies, they were not necessarily uneducated, as they may have received practical training within their communities. The participation of girls in the Gurukula system remains a debated topic. It is generally believed that women's education was imparted informally at home or through family traditions rather than in formal Gurukula settings. However, the presence of women Rishikas, female sages, and Brahmavadinis, women dedicated to spiritual knowledge, in early Vedic texts suggests that educational opportunities may have been more inclusive in earlier times. Women like Gargi Vachaknavi exemplified the intellectual rigor of Brahmavadinis, participating in scholarly debates in royal courts, as described in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Rishikas, such as Lopamudra, were revered for their compositions, which combined spiritual wisdom with practical concerns. Lopamudra's hymns often address themes of marital harmony and the balance between spiritual and worldly duties, reflecting her dual role as a sage and a householder. Rishikas and Brahmavadinis participated in Vedic rituals which were not exclusive to men. Women were entitled to perform yajnas, sacrificial rites, and could act as officiating priests in certain contexts. This inclusivity underscores the relatively egalitarian ethos of early Vedic spirituality, where women were recognized for their intellectual and spiritual capabilities. However, it is believed that this dynamic began to shift during the later Vedic and especially post-Vedic periods. During these times, societal changes and the increasing influence of patriarchal norms, as reflected in texts like the Dharma Shastras, led to significant restrictions on women's spiritual rights and contributed to caste-based social stratification. There are ongoing disputes among scholars regarding the exact period when this stratification became rigid. While some researchers associate the tightening of the Varna system with the end of the Vedic period, others argue that extreme stratification only emerged in the last centuries of the Common Era. It is generally recognized, however, that this process was significantly influenced by the composition of the Manusmriti, dated between the 2nd century before the Common Era and the 2nd century Common Era. Later, many religious communities, movements, and spiritual leaders voiced social protests against the Varna and Jati systems. These included the Bhakti movements, the Virashaivas, the Sikhs, the Kabir Panthis, the Satnami Samaj, the Ravidasya, and the Ramnamis, along with their respective leaders. However, we will explore the Bhakti tradition, its various currents, and women's participation in it in more detail in the next video. For now, we will focus on the women of the Vedic period, the Rishikas and Brahmavadinis, whose stories have come down to us through ancient scriptures. Lopamudra. Lopamudra, a celebrated figure in Vedic literature, is revered as both a philosopher and poetess Rishiki, who contributed deeply to the spiritual and intellectual traditions of ancient India. She is remembered not only as the wife of the sage and saint Agastya, but as an individual who left a lasting mark on Vedic wisdom through her own compositions and insights. According to legend, Lopamudra was created by Agastya himself, formed from the finest aspects of nature and graceful components of animals, and nurtured in a royal household. When she came of age, Agastya sought her hand in marriage, recognizing her spiritual potential and intellectual brilliance. Despite her royal upbringing, Lopamudra embraced the ascetic life with her husband, dedicating herself to the pursuit of higher truths. Lopamudra's hymns in the Rigveda showcase her depth of understanding and her ability to articulate profound spiritual truths. In one famous hymn, she engages in dialogue with Agastya, addressing the need to balance spiritual pursuits with worldly duties, particularly those of love and companionship. She eloquently advocates for the importance of harmony in marital relationships. She reminds her husband of the value of intimacy, not as a distraction, but as a sacred bond that complements spiritual practice. Her verses blend poetic beauty with philosophical insight, demonstrating her understanding of life's interconnected facets. This hymn is often cited for its revolutionary perspective, where Lopamudra openly articulates her physical and emotional needs, challenging the notion that spiritual life must entirely negate human relationships. The hymn suggests that abstinence is not inherently superior to a balanced life, where desires are not suppressed but regulated according to Dharma. Agastya, as a householder, is reminded that spiritual pursuits should not come at the cost of neglecting worldly responsibilities. In this sense, Lopamudra's plea can be considered a metaphor for the integration of material and spiritual realities, the union of Prakriti, matter, and Purusha, consciousness. Lopamudra's contribution to Vedic literature lies in her ability to integrate the material and spiritual dimensions of life. Her call conveys that spirituality is not divorced from life. Her integration of asceticism with family life lays a philosophical foundation for later Indian spiritual traditions, including Tantra, that seek to harmonize worldly life with spiritual growth. Lopamudra is considered a mantra drashta, a seer of hymns. In the tantric tradition of Sri Vidya from the Srikula school, Lopamudra Devi is credited with visualizing the Hadi Panchadasi mantra, a central mantra in Sri Vidya. This mantra is believed to have been imparted by Hayagriva to Agastya with the participation of Lopamudra. The Hadi Panchadasi mantra is regarded as one of the principal mantras in Sri Vidya. Lopamudra's name is also mentioned in the Lopamudra Vidya mantra, recognizing her significant contribution to the Sri Vidya tradition as one of its foundational figures. Maitreyi. Maitreyi, a prominent figure in Vedic literature, is celebrated as a Rishika, female sage, and seeker of ultimate truth. In some circles, Maitreyi is credited with the authorship of about 10 hymns in the Rig Veda. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, she is mentioned as one of the 2 wives of the Vedic sage Yajnavalkya. While the second wife, Katyayani, was a housewife, Maitreyi studied metaphysics and engaged in theological dialogues with her husband. Her most famous discourse, known as the Maitreyi-Yajnavalkya dialogue, preserved in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, centers on a dialogue with her husband about the nature of immortality and the realization of the self. After Yajnavalkya had fulfilled the first stages of his life, he desired to embrace the final stage of sannyasa, renunciation, in his old age. Before departing, he decided to divide his assets between his 2 wives, Maitreyi and Katyayani. When he informed Maitreyi of his decision, she expressed disinterest in material wealth, stating that it would not grant her immortality. Instead, she sought knowledge about the nature of immortality. Next, Yajnavalkya delves into the nature of immortality, emphasizing that true liberation lies in realizing the Atman self as the ultimate reality. He explains that all experiences, whether of love or knowledge, are meaningful only because of their connection to the self, and that by knowing the self, everything in the world becomes known. Throughout the discourse, Maitreyi continues to pose profound and thoughtful questions, prompting Yajnavalkya to clarify the subtle nuances of his teachings. Their dialogue unfolds as a dynamic exchange, with Maitreyi's insightful questions aimed at eliciting precise answers, highlighting the depth of her self-awareness. The discourse concludes with Yajnavalkya renouncing the household life to become a sannyasi, renunciate. Inspired by his teachings and his example, Maitreyi also chooses to renounce worldly attachments, embracing the life of a sannyasini. She wanders as an ascetic, dedicating herself to the pursuit of ultimate truth and self-realization. Her exploration of the Atman and its relationship with immortality is timeless and continues to inspire seekers of truth. Later, Adi Shankaracharya, the great seer of Advaita Vedanta, emphasized the importance of this dialogue and Maitreyi's inquiry in illustrating the oneness of Atman, eternal self or soul, and Brahman, the transcendent reality. Gargi Vachaknavi. Gargi Vachaknavi, like Maitreyi, was a Brahmavadini celebrated for her intellectual brilliance and spiritual insight. From a young age, she evinced a keen interest in Vedic scriptures and became highly proficient in the field of philosophy. She is also believed to have written many hymns in the Rig Veda. Her name is immortalized through her participation in the philosophical debates held in the court of King Janaka of Videha. At stake was a reward of 1,000 cows, each adorned with 10 gold pieces tied to their horns, along with unparalleled recognition as the greatest scholar of the land. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which we discussed earlier, sage Yajnavalkya is portrayed as having 2 wives, including Maitreyi. This Upanishad also presents him as an invincible sage engaging in philosophical debates. Yajnavalkya had already vanquished numerous scholars in these debates, some of whom, daunted by his towering intellect, refrained from challenging him altogether. Undeterred, Gargi stepped forward as the sole woman among the contenders, challenging the sage. Gargi began by posing profound questions about the cosmos, probing the very nature of existence. Her inquiries delved into the fundamental principles upon which the universe is woven. Yajnavalkya responded deeply and philosophically, describing Brahman as the ultimate substratum. However, recognizing the profundity of her inquiry, he cautioned Gargi, saying that attempting to grasp such truths without proper preparation could overwhelm the intellect. His response highlighted the limits of human reasoning when confronted with the infinite. Understanding the weight of his words, Gargi acknowledged his superiority, but her deep and fearless questioning earned her immense respect. She demonstrated that true wisdom lies not only in answers, but also in the courage to ask the deepest questions. The wisdom of the questions in this debate was not inferior to the wisdom of the answers. Apart from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Gargi also appears in the later yogic text, the Yoga Yajnavalkya, which presents a dialogue between her and Yajnavalkya. Unlike the Upanishadic debate, this text delves into yogic disciplines, pranayama, meditation, kundalini, and the science of liberation, moksha. In this discourse, Gargi, as a seeker, engages Yajnavalkya in a detailed discussion on the nature of the human body, the mind, and the ultimate path to liberation. The text integrates Vedic wisdom with yogic practice, reflecting a synthesis of Upanishadic knowledge and practical spirituality. The Yoga Yajnavalkya is considered an authoritative text in Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga traditions, influencing later yogic and tantric literature. Thus, Gargi's intellectual legacy extends beyond philosophical debate into the realm of yogic wisdom, reaffirming her place as one of the most profound women thinkers of the Vedic tradition. Rishika Gosha. Gosha is a female Indian yogini and philosopher in Vedic and early Indian spiritual literature. She is often mentioned in the context of ancient sages and ascetics associated with the Vedic tradition, and is considered a wise and learned woman. She was the daughter of the sage Kaksivan and granddaughter of Dirghatamas, both of whom were esteemed for their hymns in the Rigveda. In her youth, Gosha suffered from a debilitating skin disease, likely leprosy, which led to her disfigurement and prolonged celibacy. Determined to overcome her affliction, she fervently meditated on the Ashvins, the divine twin physicians of Vedic mythology, known for their healing abilities. Moved by her devotion, the Ashvins imparted to her the Madhu Vidya, a secret knowledge believed to restore youth and vitality. As a result, Gosha was cured of her ailment, regained her beauty, and subsequently married, bearing a son named Sustya. She is often described as a Rishika, female sage. Gosha's scholarly prowess is evident in her composition of 2 hymns in the Rigveda, both dedicated to the Ashvins. The first hymn extols their divine attributes and healing powers, while the second reflects her personal aspirations and gratitude. These hymns are found in the 10th mandala, Book 10, hymns 39 and 40, each comprising 14 verses. Renowned as a mantradrika, one well-versed in mantras, and a Brahmavadini, a proclaimer of Brahman, Gosha exemplified the role of women in Vedic society, who were not only scholars, but also active participants in spiritual and intellectual discourses. Her life and works underscore the significant contributions of women to Vedic literature and philosophy. Vak Ambhrini. Vak Ambhrini is the daughter of Rishi Ambrina, is a celebrated figure in the Rigveda, revered as both a Rishika and the seer of the Ambhrini Sukta from Rigveda, also known as the Devi Sukta or Vak Sukta. This hymn, one of the most profound in Vedic literature, is a declaration of the divine nature of speech and sound, Vak, and the cosmic power it embodies. The Ambhrini Sukta is a testament to Vak's spiritual realization. In this hymn, Vak speaks in the first person, identifying herself as the cosmic principle of speech and equating herself with the divine power that permeates the universe. Vak in the Vedic context refers to speech, sound, and the power of expression. However, it is far more than mere verbal communication. It represents the cosmic principle of creation and manifestation. Speech, Vak, is imbued with the power to create, sustain, and transform existence, echoing the profound Vedic understanding that the universe emerges through divine sound. Although Vak, in the Rigvedic tradition, is an independent goddess, she can be understood as an expression of the supreme goddess in sound and speech, seamlessly linked to various forms of the mother goddess, Para-Shakti, Adi-Shakti, Sri Adya, or Durga. She embodies divine sound infused with the creative power to manifest the cosmos. As the bridge between the unmanifest, Nirguna, and the manifest, Saguna, Vak is the goddess herself in her dynamic aspect, the cosmic vibration that initiates creation. Vak Ambhrini can be regarded as an unsurpassed mantradrika, as the Devi Sukta reveals 8 profound mantras embodying the principle of Vak, the divine speech and cosmic sound. In one mantra, Devi proclaims herself as the inner self of all gods, the essence that empowers and sustains their divine functions. In another, she declares herself as the all-powerful Parameswari, the ultimate granter of all wishes and the fruits of sacrifices, and the sole dispenser of wealth and prosperity. She is exalted as the most supreme among all deities, the one to whom all worship and offerings ultimately reach. The Devi Sukta's proclamation of Vak as the cosmic force that empowers the gods and governs creation aligns closely with tantric traditions, where the mother goddess is venerated as the supreme power, Shakti. Vak is celebrated as the dynamic aspect of the goddess, whose divine sound is the source of all manifestation and transformation. Sulabha. Brahmavadini Sulabha is a renowned figure in Indian spiritual history, celebrated as a woman sage, wandering ascetic, Rishika, and philosopher during the Mithila kingdom. In the Mahabharata, she appears in the Shanti Parva, engaging in a philosophical discourse with King Janaka of Videha, celebrated for his detachment and spiritual insight. According to the narrative, Sulabha, a highly realized ascetic, visits Janaka to test the depth of his realization. Using her advanced yogic power, Sanchodayashyanti, Sulabha entered a subtle state that enabled her to question and explore from within. This allowed her to initiate a deep philosophical debate on the nature of detachment, liberation, and non-duality by directly penetrating the mind itself. The debate revolved around the king's claim of being a Videha, one who is free from attachment and bodily identification, despite his role as a ruler engaged in worldly responsibilities. Engaging in a profound debate with the king, Sulabha emphasizes that the realization of the self transcends all worldly identities, including gender and social roles. Sulabha's discourse with King Janaka in the Mahabharata is fundamentally a revelation of Atmatattva, the essential truth of the self, Atman. She pointed out that clinging to the ego, even in subtle forms such as identifying as a detached householder or a wise king, obstructs realization of the self's non-dual nature. Sulabha's teachings align with Advaita Vedanta, focusing on the non-duality of the self and the ultimate reality, Brahman. Sulabha's discourse in the Mahabharata is also a powerful assertion of gender equality in the realm of spiritual realization. Her life serves as a reminder that true wisdom and liberation are beyond the constraints of gender or social hierarchy. Sulabha's story stands as a testament to the rich tradition of women philosophers and sages in Indian history, highlighting their role in shaping the spiritual and intellectual heritage of the subcontinent. Sulabha is also credited with being the Rishika who wrote the Sulabha Samhita, a text that is considered lost. Some later sources suggest that it was once a part of the Rig Veda, but no known manuscripts or excerpts are available today to confirm this. Thus, history remains complex and often uncertain. Some knowledge is lost, some may have been deliberately concealed, and much of it is based on conjecture. In studying that ancient era, we can only rely on what remains available to us. So, despite their significant contributions, the status of Rishikas and Brahmavadinis evolved over time. During these later periods, societal changes and the increasing influence of patriarchal norms, as reflected in texts like the Dharma Shastras, led to significant restrictions on women's spiritual rights. The Dharma Shastras enforced strict adherence to caste groups and the four Varnas, dividing people into classes based on occupations to which they were restricted from birth. Unlike the Upanishads, which emphasized individual qualities, the Varna system in this era was determined strictly at birth rather than by personal attributes. Women in particular faced severe limitations on their rights and opportunities for self-realization. Women were increasingly excluded from participating in philosophical assemblies and Vedic debates. Their roles in rituals were curtailed, with ritualistic and spiritual responsibilities becoming more male-dominated. Furthermore, the growing emphasis on women's domestic roles and household responsibilities limited their time and opportunities for spiritual study and engagement. However, as we will later see in Bhakti traditions, women transformed even household chores into acts of devotion to the divine by singing hymns and devotional songs as exemplified in the story of Janabai. It is believed that during the Smriti Yuga it was forbidden to even read the Vedas in the presence of women Shudras. However, they were allowed to acquire knowledge from the Puranas, which were considered more accessible and suited to the general population, although this practice also appears to have declined by the 12th century. Thus, in the Vedic period, society was divided into four broad categories or varnas, and this division was based on guna, qualities, and karma, actions, not strictly by birth. A person's role in society could theoretically change based on their abilities and deeds. The emphasis was on fulfilling one's dharma, duty, appropriate to their role, but these roles were not rigidly enforced by birthright. In the post-Vedic period, the Varna system became rigid and evolved into the hereditary Jati system, with thousands of subcastes based on birth and occupation. Social mobility was restricted, and the concept of purity and pollution became more prominent, leading to stricter rules around food, marriage, and social interaction. In these times, societal norms were largely patriarchal, and women were primarily seen as playing complementary roles to men within the framework of family and household responsibilities. The specific duties of the Varnas, caste duties, were typically prescribed for men, while women were largely responsible for managing the household, raising children, and upholding family dharma. The Manusmriti and other texts explicitly stated that a woman should be under the protection of her father in childhood, her husband in adulthood, and her sons in old age, claiming that a woman is never capable of independence. In these times, women generally had limited access to education, religious rights, and independent decision-making. However, this model was more prevalent among the upper Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. This was due to their socio-economic structure, which allowed families the resources to follow these delineated roles. In contrast, among the Shudras, who were often laborers, artisans, or engaged in service professions, economic survival required the contribution of all family members. Women in these communities frequently worked alongside men, whether in agriculture, crafts, or domestic service for wealthier households. Brahmins were considered custodians of Vedic knowledge, holding exclusive authority over Vedic rituals, scriptural interpretation, and priestly functions. They were responsible for maintaining and transmitting sacred texts and performing yajnas, Vedic sacrifices. Higher Varnas, such as Kshatriyas and Vaishyas, generally had greater access to temples or could sponsor rituals and patrons of Brahmins. The lower Varna, the Shudras, the laboring class, were largely excluded from Vedic rituals and scriptural learning. However, they might have participated in folk or community rituals led by Brahmins for communal purposes. Over time, another social group emerged outside the four Varnas, labeled as untouchables, Adishudras, or Avarnas, those without Varna. Untouchables, now referred to as Dalits, were typically barred from entering temples or participating in religious ceremonies. As a result, they created new rituals, priests, and deities. They also often joined movements such as the Sant and Bhakti traditions, or Tantric and Shaivite traditions, where they could, in a sense, achieve spiritual equality and freedom. They were associated with activities considered polluting, believed to compromise the ritual purity of higher castes. However, not all individuals deemed impure were classified as untouchables. Even within the caste system, Shudras, the fourth Varna, faced stigma as impure, though they were not as marginalized as those outside the Varna system. The concept of purity and impurity was a tool to legitimize social inequality and maintain caste hierarchy. This framework ensured the dominance of higher castes while suppressing the agency and rights of Dalits and other marginalized groups. Women in this system faced a dual burden, constrained by the caste hierarchy on one hand and patriarchal prejudices on the other. They faced numerous hardships and social injustices imposed under the guise of righteous dharma. For instance, in some parts of India, widowed women were often pressured, directly or indirectly, to perform the practice of self-immolation on their husband's funeral pyre, a ritual known as sati. This ritual was romanticized in certain cultural narratives and communities, portraying it as the ultimate expression of loyalty and virtue. So, it is essential to acknowledge that the Rishikas and Brahmavadinis of the Vedic period represent a remarkable era when women actively engaged in the pursuit and dissemination of spiritual knowledge, standing as examples of their equal rights in this sacred domain. Although women's voices gradually receded into the background in later periods under pressure from social and cultural conditions, the legacy of enlightened women like the Rishikas and Brahmavadinis endures as an inspiration for understanding the universal nature of spiritual wisdom, transcending cultural, historical, social, and gender boundaries.